Our coverage today does begin with an announcement that Secretary Pete Hegseth made yesterday. The secretary saying that the U.S. military is moving forward with plans to build a facility in Idaho to train pilots from Qatar. Hegseth making the announcement yesterday during a visit by Qatar's defense minister. The facility will be housed at an Air Force base roughly 50 miles south of Boise. Hegseth saying this yesterday.
I'm also proud that today we're signing a letter of acceptance to build a Qatari Emiri Air Force facility at the Mountain Home Air Base in Idaho. The location will be host a contingent of Qatari F-15s and pilots to enhance our combined training, increase lethality, interoperability. It's just another example of our partnership.
So I've gotten a lot of questions about this story over the past 24 hours. Standing by to answer a few of those is retired Marine Intelligence Officer, national security analyst, and host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer. Hal, some people are hearing this story and thinking that it sounds a little off, but the Pentagon says similar facilities have been set up for other allies for decades, and the Idaho base already hosts a fighter squadron from Singapore. So is it fair to say that this type of arrangement isn't unusual?
Austin, it's actually very common. One of the things, and particularly it's more on the air side that we see that, whether it's fighting fighters or air defense systems, stuff like that. You know, for years I was under a command that was in Fort Bliss out in Texas, which is right on the border. Kind of famous for all the stuff that's been done there with border control, or I should say border security issues. But on that base was where they did all the air defense stuff, the Patriot missiles. And at that time, we had a lot of Germans that would come through, German military that would come through, and that's where they would train. And the reason why is there's just a lot of space out there. We have these enormous training areas, particularly in the western United States, southwest and northwest, where they can go out and do these things that they can't do back at home because Europe especially, but also if you look at the Gulf, the Persian Gulf or the Arab Gulf, as they call it, Arabian Gulf, I should say, that it's a very constricted airspace, very constricted area to do training. So what this does is it provides them a tremendous opportunity to do training over a broad area. Of course, they're not going to see a lot of snow in Qatar either. So they're going to do training with some environments, doing landings, takeoffs, and stuff that they wouldn't normally see at home. But the big thing is they get to actually work with U.S. forces. And this is part of that joint coalition stuff that we do there, where they go out there and they practice, air-to-air combat, strike missions and stuff, working hand in glove with U.S. Air Force personnel and figuring out how to do these joint missions, whether for combat air patrol or for something else. And that's just something they can't get somewhere else. So it is very common in the U.S. to see this. But I want to just say one of the features of El Paso at Fort Bliss is the Germans came in and they actually created their own German restaurant on the base. It was kind of a unique thing. And it was kind of famous throughout the Department of Defense that if you go to Fort Bliss, you got to go to the German restaurant because they had this fantastic German food. That's how big the German presence was at one of our Western U.S. bases.
So just to make something super clear, because I got this question a lot yesterday, there is not a Qatari military base being built in the United States. That's not how you classify something like this, correct?
No, it's an air facility. That is a U.S. Air Force base, all right? And that is simply an air facility. It will be run by the Qataris, paid for by the Qataris, and that's where they will do all sorts of stuff. And you can be assured there will be a bunch of U.S. presence in and around that facility because, for F-15s and all the stuff that goes with that, you have at least a very heavy U.S. contractor presence. And it actually makes it a lot easier to have that here in the U.S. as opposed to putting all those contractors over in Qatar. However, with that said, I'm sure there will be U.S. contractors over there. But that's what this is. It's actually on a U.S. Air Force base. And look, I've been stationed all over the world, and I will tell you, it's very common for us to be on a base that is, whether it's a Japanese base or some other country's base somewhere else. And but we have our own facilities and stuff that we do on that base, and then we provide usually our own inner perimeter security around our facilities and stuff like that as well. And that's kind of what the Qataris will be doing too. They'll have their own facility on one of our Air Force bases, but they'll be working very closely. They're a what we call a tenant command aboard a U.S. Air Force base. And on that particular base, you have Singapore and you have Qatar, and it's going to be a very international base by the time it's all done.
So just to expand on what you said here, so there are security and oversight measures to reassure Americans about foreign pilots training in the States.
Absolutely. Yeah, these are all highly controlled things. And I would say, for example, in Arizona, we had Ukrainian pilots training there for the F-16s. All right, that was kind of famous. It was in the news. But if you go out to, for example, Luke Air Force Base, that's where they train the F-35 or F-22 pilots out there. I think they also train F-35 pilots out there as well. You'll find a number of foreign pilots that are there. And if you ever go out to Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, you will, if you ever walk into the exchange, you'll see a bunch of foreign flight uniforms walking around the exchange, and that's just normal. It's an area where we can do a lot of training, and where they have a permanent facility or they're over here temporarily, it provides them an ability to do something that they can't do at home, usually because of constricted airspace. In fact, of note, the Israelis do a lot of training here in the U.S. They have kind of a permanent presence, at least at one or two bases out here, and part of that is because Israel is very confined airspace. They just can't do the type of flying that they would like to do in the confines of Israeli Air Force airspace.
So, from a strategic standpoint, what does the U.S. gain from strengthening Qatar's Air Force capabilities?
It's a force multiplier. What it does is it brings up their Air Force to a standard of performance, a standard of operability, and I should say a standard of interoperability, where they can work closely with our Air Force, but also work with other regional air forces out there. You'll find Saudi military will train in the U.S. You'll find UAE military will train in the U.S. Kuwait military train in the U.S. Basically, all their neighbors, Bahraini, everybody around them trains in the U.S. Whether they're permanent facility presence or they just come over here as detachments. But they train here all the time, and what it does is it brings up everybody to a high level. And some of this are lessons that came out of the Gulf War, Desert Storm, where the Saudi pilots were, yes, they've been trained here, but we realized that when they got over there that interoperability, that ability to fly at the same level that our pilots were flying, that it was not there, wasn't sustained at the level we would have liked to seen. So we've been, since then, over the last 30 years, really trying to improve the level of performance of our allied pilots, allied air crews, allied capabilities, if you will, with aviation and air defense.
Why Mountain Home Air Force Base? If you can think it through, I mean, is it just because there's a lot of space out there?
Look at the picture and then look around the Air Force Base. That's why. All right. There's just a lot of space out there. And when you're looking at aviation training, I know it's kind of a gruesome thing to think about, but you're looking for places where if something goes wrong, planes could set down. If there's a mishap in the air, that you're less likely to cause fatalities on the ground. And that's why, central Nevada, large parts of western Arizona, certainly up there in Idaho, and flying over Montana and some of these other places like Wyoming, there's just a lot of open space. It's sparsely populated areas. And unfortunately, things do happen in the air. And when you're training pilots, you want to have a lot of options if something goes wrong, because things will go wrong.
How would you describe the trajectory of the U.S.-Qatari relationship throughout the course of the second Trump administration?
I think it's actually really increased a lot. I think what's happened is, we had a very close relationship. You got to remember, our biggest Al Udeid, that's our biggest base that we have in the Gulf, is that air base. It's huge. And it's primarily an Air Force base, but it's also like a forward presence for U.S. Central Command out there. It's a very joint sort of base. And of course, anyone who flies in there, if they fly in commercial, they go through that tremendous Doha airport as well. So it's it's a global hub, if you will, for air traffic. But that base is important. So we have a very close relationship with Qataris. And with that said, with them acting as mediators, working with Hamas, or basically talking to Hamas, and of course, what has just been accomplished. And don't forget, the Israelis struck Hamas offices in Doha, and in some ways that kind of brought us together, because you remember that was very famous, where Netanyahu was sitting there in the White House with President Trump, and basically compelled to pick up the phone and actually apologize to Qatar for launching a strike on their sovereign territory. All these things are part of that bonding piece in international diplomacy, which kind of brings us together. And I think that we feel that we crossed the threshold. And also, don't forget, they did gift us with a 787 that is being retrofitted to be an Air Force One. So there's a pretty strong relationship there.